Learning Chinese has never been easier with Simplified Chinese. I mean, it's in the name, isn't it? Look at how beautifully simple these characters are compared to their horrible, complex, traditional character counterparts. Instead of needing to do a billion different strokes to write the word fei or fly, you can just do 1, 2, 3. You're done. You can lean back and kick your feet up on the table. It's just that easy. You might be thinking, if Simplified Chinese is so easy, why isn't everyone using it? Why would Chinese people in Hong Kong and Taiwan choose to stick to the harder, more difficult characters when they have such a simpler option available? Like, why? Why would I, as someone who speaks Cantonese, choose to write all 26 strokes for the word wu guai or wu gui, turtle, when I can just write it in 11 strokes? Are people in Hong Kong and Taiwan crazy? Are they masochists or something? What if I told you there was actually a reason, beyond political ones, why some people might prefer one over the other, and that the citizens of Hong Kong and Taiwan aren't just beating themselves up for fun? Today at CWE Character Wrestling Entertainment, we're gonna settle once and for all, which is the better system? Simplified or traditional? Which is better? Which should you learn? And can Chinese people read both? Why do they have two systems? So before we jump into things, let's introduce our two contestants. Traditional Chinese, more commonly known as 繁体字 or 繁体字, is our veteran fighter with a small but dedicated fan base. Today, traditional Chinese characters is still officially used in Taiwan, Macau, and Hong Kong over Simplified Chinese. It might look scary, but in reality, these characters are actually easier. But we don't want to spoil the matchup before it starts, so we'll get back to that later. Instead, let's move on to our next contestant. Simplified Chinese. Simplified Chinese, more commonly known as 简体字 or 簡体字, is the main system of writing used in mainland China and Singapore. Fan favorite of our matchup today, the one that everyone loves. Now, Simplified Chinese doesn't really have a creation date to speak, because it's not really a thing, but rather a process, one that's actually still going on today. See, Chinese characters have continuously evolved over time. New characters coming and going, and old ones changing based on the needs of Chinese people. Back then, Chinese literacy rates were low because who could memorize all these characters? So as a part of kind of like an ongoing effort to help the Chinese population learn to read their own language, the Chinese government went through multiple rounds of simplification to make their characters easier to pick up. And so we've got an incredible matchup today. The veteran, who is secretly easier, versus the fan favorite that everyone views as easier. Who is going to come out on top? So without further ado, let's begin with our first category, ease of writing. This one's a no-brainer, right? Come on, you're asking which of these characters is easier to write? It's kind of like asking me to draw a stickman version of myself or like a detailed portrait. Simplified Chinese, 1 point. Next is ease of memorization. The introduction of Simplified Chinese made it so much easier for people living in China to write their own language. And it's not just the actual number of strokes either. Everything was simplified down to the number of characters you need to memorize. In Chinese, where just a couple of little strokes can change the meaning of the pronunciation of the entire word, it's important to be able to read and recognize characters easily. It might be a little easier to distinguish between characters when the characters are not that difficult, like the word for fork, cha or ta, and the word for again, yo or yao. But what about the word like li, like the word for history, compared to the word like li, like for calendar? They even have the same pronunciation and they look so similar and traditional. And so here's where Simplified Chinese gets a good hit on traditional Chinese. In Simplified Chinese, the first li is written as this, much simpler. In fact, it's 9 less strokes to write than its traditional form. The second one is also written like that, and it takes 13 less strokes to write than its traditional form. Whoa, these are kind of the same, aren't they though? See, Simplified Chinese use something called merging of homophonous characters to make their language easier. In simpler words, they take all the words that sound the same with the same phonetic component, the same sound component, and in turn, make them look the same too. Take these words for example. They're all pronounced meng or mong, and they all have the same component on the right side. So what does Simplified Chinese do? Let's just make them all one character. So this way, instead of memorizing a million different variations of a character, you just need to memorize one, because everything is the same. Now, in theory, this makes it easier to learn, but later on, we'll see why this is actually a curse. But for now, ease of memorization, Simplified Chinese, 2, traditional Chinese, still 0. Guys, I swear traditional's on the comeback, okay? This is only the beginning and the net is still young. Let's move on to the next. Cultural significance. Let's take our eyes off the category of ease for a second. By the way, ease of reading is going to be a crazy round, by the way. Chinese as a language is ancient, with roots that trace back to nearly 1250 BC, and the cultural significance of the two scripts is really important. This means that there are a lot of written works that exist in Chinese, and most of these works are obviously in traditional Chinese because Simplified Chinese was not around during that time. In fact, Simplified Chinese wasn't even standardized until the 20th century. And so all those beautiful ancient Chinese poems, philosophy, artworks, calligraphy, all those beautiful paintings, they're all pretty hard to read if you don't know traditional Chinese. That's thousands of years of history and culture that most people wouldn't be able to access without prior knowledge of these more complicated characters. I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna say right here, I went to Beijing with a Taiwanese friend and a mainland China friend, and we were in the Beijing museums, and the mainland China friend had a lot of trouble reading kind of like the historical things, whereas the Taiwanese friend, they're like, no problem. And so while Simplified Chinese might be useful in helping Chinese spread and grow as a language, it also means that a lot of Chinese heritage, culture, and pride are sort of left in the dust. See, Chinese characters aren't just drawings that people use in place of an alphabet, they're actual words with meanings embedded into their design, packed with over 3,000 years of history. They were a way for authors to show their creativity and thoughts in a unique way that simply can't be done with Simplified Chinese. Take, for example, the word love. One of the components in the traditional version of it is the character xin or some for heart. Fitting, right? The simplified version of this looks like this, though. It takes away the word for heart, but it still has the word for yao, friend. So it has the word for friend, but not heart. And so it took that word away, and it has a surface level meaning still the same of love, but how can one love without a heart? And so you can think of Simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese like taking the highway versus the scenic route. While yes, Simplified Chinese might be quicker to pick up and use, but you'd be missing out on so much history and culture that really can only be accessed through the use of traditional Chinese. And so with that, traditional Chinese delivers a devastating blow to Simplified Chinese. 1 point traditional Chinese, 2-1. But the fight's not over yet. Let's move on to the final round and settle this for all. Ease of reading and use. You might be thinking, really, Sheldon? Really? Like, is there any question which system is easier to read? The traditional Chinese fans might as well just pack up their bags and go home at this point. Like, the fight's over. Don't leave just yet, because the outcome might surprise you. On one hand, there's no denying that when reading a bunch of text, Simplified Chinese is so much easier on the eyes than traditional Chinese. Like, look at this. But when you think about how good someone is at reading any language, we usually base it on 2 criteria, speed and accuracy, or how quickly you can understand what you're reading. Now for speed, Simplified Chinese wins by a long shot. Take the earlier example, li. If you've got the word zoomed in like this, yeah, you can probably tell that they're different, but what if those words were smaller, or zoomed out, or we were kind of far away? Pretty hard to read, right? How would you even write that out without making it look like a bunch of squiggles? There's also the problem of choosing which word to use in a situation. See, in Simplified Chinese, you can just pop the same character out for a lot of words and be done with it. Can't remember how to write the character for hair? Fa. Versus the character for to send, fa, fat. It doesn't matter because in Simplified Chinese, they're both the same thing. Fa. By the way, guys, remember how I said this is secretly a curse? That's coming. But for now, a devastating blow to traditional Chinese, who's looking a little bit shaky right now. But though Simplified Chinese might seem less cluttered than traditional Chinese, there is a weak point, a very big weak point. Inconsistency and ambiguity. Because while Simplified Chinese might look easier to read than traditional Chinese, the way that a lot of these characters are simplified is quite inconsistent. Let me give you an example. Take this character over here. It's pronounced guo, okay? Now I'm gonna show you a few simplified characters and I want you to guess what they sound like. So now assuming you can't read Chinese and you watched our video on the secret of Chinese characters, you probably guessed, okay, guo, 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 guo. Oh, what's the last one? What is that weird line little accent thing? What's that third one? It's a little bit different too. Now, before I tell you if you're right or wrong, this is that same first character from earlier, but in traditional Chinese. Once again, it's pronounced guo. Now, I want you to look at the traditional version of those same words from earlier. Now, I want you to try and guess the pronunciation. I'm gonna go on a whim here, but I'm gonna guess they were all pronounced some kind of guo with a variation in tone. So guo, 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 guo. Maybe something like that. And you're right. Guo, 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 guo. Basically all the same. So yes, all of these characters are pronounced the exact same, just different tones. But notice the traditional one has the same sound component shown very clearly, while the simplified version doesn't. It's a little bit inconsistent. Traditional is so much more consistent, and frankly, makes so much more sense. And this is the beauty of traditional Chinese characters. The best way to think about this is that there are more hints to help a learner with figuring out what the word means or what the word should sound like. It's kind of like, imagine I drew all the US presidents for you in stickman form. Of course, it'd be easier than drawing the portrait, but now if I ask you to look at all the stickmen and name for me all the US presidents, probably the only one you'd get is Abraham Lincoln if I drew his hat, and maybe George Washington if I drew the funky hair. Maybe Trump if I drew his hair, but it's a little hard. So when it comes to differentiating them and reading them and figuring out which is which, suddenly the portraits are actually super easy. On top of that, if we add in the fact that handwriting characters is not that big of a deal today, like most Chinese people have actually forgotten how to handwrite a lot of characters. You can see a lot of videos on that because digital input has made Chinese so much easier. Suddenly, the argument for traditional seems a lot more appealing. Now it's time for Simplified Chinese's Achilles heel. So on top of this, going back to Simplified Chinese's earlier benefit of less memorization, while merging multiple characters into one has its benefits, it doesn't come without its problems too. Because now instead of being able to distinguish between pronunciation based on the character, you kind of just have to guess based on contextual clues. Take for example the word gan. This word in simplified would be gan, which is also the simplified version of tian, fawn in Cantonese, which is also a simplified version of gan. So if you saw this word, which pronunciation do I use? Do I use gan, tian, or do I use gan? Oh my god, I don't know which one to use. I need more context. You don't know. On top of that, it's also harder to memorize now because, hey, you kind of have to memorize 3 things for one character, and your brain, it actually has a harder time to memorize when you do that because it's harder to differentiate. And before I knock simplified fully, like traditional also has like one character with multiple pronunciations is common in Chinese, but simplified takes it to another level. So now based on context, this word now has different pronunciations and different meanings, and gotta more stuff to memorize. So suddenly, simplified Chinese ain't looking too hot either. So who wins the reading battle? Both have their flaws, yet both have their advantage. I think this one is fair to decide as a tie. And now if I go back to then memorization, because simplified also has these extra things to memorize, I guess, should that one be a tie too? Okay, let's make that one a tie too. Tie game. So now which is better? On the surface, simplified looks to be better, but really it comes down to what you value and prefer. The truth is neither one of these systems is better than the other. People in Hong Kong and Taiwan learn traditional just fine. People in mainland China learn simplified just fine. And people in each of those places, in Hong Kong and Taiwan, will argue traditional is easier to learn for them or easier to read for them, whereas people in mainland China will argue that simplified is so much easier to read for them. And so which one you use really depends on where you live and who you're talking to, as well as just plain old personal preference. If you're looking to go to the mainland China or Singapore, it makes sense to learn simplified over traditional. And once you figure out the main differences between the two, it's not so hard to go from one or the other, to be honest. There is no right answer here. Let's just appreciate both systems and all the wonderful ways Chinese has evolved. If you enjoyed the video, then click here to watch the secret to read 90% of all Chinese characters we talked about in this video, and click here if you're a Cantonese speaker who wants to learn Mandarin.